Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place that takes these really complex industry narratives, digs into the sources, and tries to figure out why things seem to be, well, exploding.
Yeah, and today we're really diving into Hollywood, Tinseltown. For, a century? It was this engine of global imagination.
Right, the dream factory.
But the sources we've looked at, and it's an extensive critique, they argue it's now in this deep, self-inflicted spiral. Entropy is the word.
It's quite the picture. And the core question these sources wrestle with, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Is Hollywood too big to fail, or is it actually too big to succeed?
And the answer they land on is, well, frankly alarming. They say yes to both.
Yes to both. How does that work?
Well, too big to fail culturally, maybe, historically, but potentially too big, too unwieldy to succeed under its current model, which they argue is just fundamentally broken.
Okay, so our mission today, our deep dive, is to really unpack that argument. The sources are saying it's this toxic mix, right? Ideological hyperactivism.
Yeah, corporatism just chasing Wall Street growth.
And a good dose of humor. And specifically, they focus on how diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, was implemented, arguing it directly caused this massive financial and, you could say, cultural breakdown.
Absolutely. That's the core thesis we're digging.
And you don't really have to squint too hard to see the symptoms they're talking about. I mean, look at the domestic box office.
Oh, it's nowhere near 2019 levels, nowhere close. Even when you factor in higher ticket prices, the actual number of people going is way down.
It feels like a different era entirely.
And you hear it in the industry chatter, too. That phrase executives were apparently using, survive until 25.
I remember.
Well, now the sources say it's shifted grimly. It's become survive 25. That tells you something about the level of anxiety. Palpable, real uncertainty about even the near future.
So if you boil down the main critique running through all this material we looked at, the sources basically argue Hollywood made one giant mistake.
Which was?
In their, let's say, colorful language.
Yeah.
Thing with the money.
Meaning the audience, the paying customer.
Exactly. They argue the industry stopped trying to entertain that broad audience and, in some ways, turned them into the enemy.
And the result? Well, apathy. People just stopped caring. Or even worse, some corners of the internet seem to be actively enjoying watching the industry struggle.
Yeah, the sources suggest that for those critics, seeing what they call woke Hollywood fail isn't some random accident. It looks more like consequence culture, a direct result of pushing away the very people who buy the tickets. #I. The ideological blind spot and audience alien.
So let's dig into that ideological shift first, because the sources really hammer this. A fundamental change in priority right at the top, driven by activist pressures, ended up alienating a huge chunk of the mainstream audience.
And they put a number on it, didn't they? Something like up to 40% of the core movie-going audience just walked away.
That's the figure cited in some reports, yeah. And this shift, they argue, it came from a new group of gatekeepers. Their mantra apparently was, male and pale is stale.
Okay, but that wasn't just like a suggestion floating around.
No. According to the sources, this was actively enforced through corporate policies, HR departments, and maybe most powerful through the standards set by the Academy, the Oscars.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is crucial to their argument. We're talking about those new mandatory inclusion, the ones for Best Picture eligibility.
Exactly. This wasn't just symbolic. The critique is that this directly shaped what kind of movies got greenlit and how they were made, because everyone wants a shot at Best Picture.
So these aren't guidelines, they're requirements. Across these 4 big categories, standards A, B, C, and they kicked in from 2024 onwards, right? You have to meet these just to be considered.
Right. And the level of detail is pretty striking. Standard A, for example, that's about on-screen representation. To pass that standard, a film needs to hit one of 3 specific targets.
Okay, what are they?
Option 1, have at least one lead character or a major supporting character from an underrepresented racial or ethnic group. Option 2, fill 30% of all the smaller roles with actors from 2 underrepresented, and that includes women, LGBT plus people, people with disabilities, and racial or ethnic.
30% of minor roles. That's quite specific.
It is. Or Option 3, the main storyline itself, the theme, the whole subject has to be centered on one of those underrepresented.
So hang on. If you're making, say, a historical drama about Viking, or something where the historical context doesn't naturally lend itself to that kind of numerical diversity, you're immediately forced to alter the story or casting just to qualify.
That's the implication, according to the critique. You have to engineer the content to meet the standard. And it doesn't stop with what's on screen. Standard B goes behind the camera.
Right. The crew and creative leads.
Exactly. Standard B looks at creative leadership and the project team. Here, a A film has to meet criteria in two different areas, like ensuring at least two key creative leadership, think DP, composer, editor, production designer, are filled by people from underrepresented groups.
Two key roles.
And crucially, at least one of those has to be from a specific underrepresented racial or ethnic. So these hiring decisions are being shaped by the standards before you even finish the script.
And then there's C and D. What do they cover?
Standard C is about industry access and opportunity. It mandates things like paid internships or apprenticeship programs for underrepresented, building the pipeline, basically.
Okay.
And Standard D focuses on audience development. It requires that the studio have multiple senior executives from underrepresented groups working on the marketing, publicity, or distribution of that film.
Wow.
It is. And the sources, using some very critical, very pointed language, they label these standards as DEI, sometimes CRT mandates. They argue it creates a system built on quota, exclusion, and ultimately discrimination against meritocracy, prioritizing identity over talent.
Which leads us to that really biting line from one source, the one that got a lot of attention online, that the only truly underrepresented group left in Hollywood is people of talent, POT.
Yeah, it's a deeply cynical take, but it paints this picture of systemic discrimination being justified, even mandated, under this banner of inclusion.
And the argument follows that this directly impacts the bottom line, the commercial viability, if you're prioritizing identity metrics over, say, proven storytelling ability or broad audience appeal.
You end up with what the sources bluntly call woke.
Right, and they provide examples. High-profile one, like Bros, the romantic comedy.
Yeah, big push for that film. Landmark LGBTQ plus represent. Production budget around $22 million, but it only made back about $1 million.
And didn't the star, Billy Eichner, get into hot water for supposedly calling potential audiences homophobic? That probably didn't help ticket sales.
Likely not. It feeds that narrative of antagonizing the audience. Then there's She Said, the film about the Harvey Weinstein. Respectable budget, around $30 million. Critically acclaimed in many.
But it bombed.
Completely. Barely made $14 million worldwide. These weren't even massive blockbusters. They were mid-budget films, the kind that used to do okay, but they just couldn't find an audience, despite all the institutional backing and positive press.
And on streaming, the sources point to Mrs. Marvel.
Right. The Disney Plus series. Teenage Muslim superhero, huge critical buzz, meant to be a big moment for Marvel's fate. But the Nielsen numbers cited suggest it was like a real disconnect between the internal hype, the critical reception, and how many people actually watched.
But it's not always straightforward, is it? The sources also bring up The Woman King.
That's the interesting counterexample, or complicated. Historical drama, the Agoji female warriors in Africa. It actually had a decent opening, even though it landed on what was apparently one of the worst box office weekends in decades.
So, a success then?
A relative success, yes. But even here, the sources highlight the ideological framing around it. They point to comments from the star, Viola Davis.
What did she say?
Along the lines of, if audiences didn't show up, they'd be sending a message that Black women cannot lead the box office globally.
So the critique isn't about the film itself, but the messaging, that buying a ticket becomes this political statement you have to make.
Exactly. It reinforces that idea. Hollywood turning the audience into a political group needing correction rather than just people looking for a good.
What's really telling, though, is the stuff about internal doubt. The sources mention anonymous executives.
Yes, senior film execs, specifically identified as white males count. And they admitted, apparently, that for about 3 years after the big industry shifts around race and hashtag, they hired exclusive women.
Exclusively.
That's the claim site. And they confess that, in their view, some of those hires were not able to do the jobs they got. They saw it as an overcorrection.
That's a pretty stark admission. Driven by fear, presumably.
That's the implication. Yeah. Fear of cancellation, fear of disciplinary action. The sources suggest this fear led to a situation where ideological alignment, or just fitting the demographic need, became more important than actual competence for the role.
And that climate of fear connects to what the sources call gaslighting of the paying customer. This idea that the media outlets close to the studios, the access media.
Yeah, the big trades, the entertainment sites.
They kept publishing articles, essentially telling audiences, hey, that thing you didn't like, it's actually brilliant because it challenges you.
Right. The examples given are pretty classic now. The Last Jedi disrespects Star Wars nostalgia. Good. That means it's mature, moving beyond childish things, and or doesn't feel like Star Wars. Excellent. That means it's sophisticated and political.
So the audience's own tastes, their own preferences, were being framed as immature, or worse, bigoted.
Pretty much. If you didn't like the message, or the way they subverted the characters, or the casting, the implication was often that you were the problem, not them.
And this constant friction, this almost hostile messaging, is what the sources argue finally broke the relationship. Hollywood effectively told a large part of its audience to well, get lost.
And they did. They walked away. Mass apathy set in, which is why, the sources argue, when Hollywood started failing financially, many former fans didn't feel sympathy. They felt vindicated. Hollywood had made the customer the adversary, and now the adversary wasn't showing.
Okay, so the audience walks away. But that's tied directly to the second huge issue these sources identify, the destruction of intellectual property, IP, the very thing that was supposed to make the whole streaming gamble work financially.
Exactly. This whole shift to the IP era, it promised stability, recurring revenue, predictable audience. But the critique is that the corporations, in their desperate chase for never-ending growth, ended up, well, vandalizing their own crown.
Let's look at the examples they give, because they're pretty big franchise. Star Wars comes up a lot.
Oh, yeah. The sources argue Disney essentially killed the golden goose twice. First, by discarding the expanded universe decades of books, comics, games that fans love. Then, after the divisive sequel trilogy, they doubled down with shows like Obi-Wan that many felt further damaged the core characters and lore. It's framed as a failure of basic ship.
And Marvel, the unbeatable MCU,
showing definite signs of wear and tear, according to diminishing returns at the box office. Sure, Spider-Man does well, but that's partly Sony. Many Phase 4 and 5 films struggled to hit that billion-dollar mark that almost automatic audience.
And the Disney Plus shows haven't all been home runs either.
Far from. Some are cited as outright failures in terms of generating buzz, sustained viewership compared to their cost. And it's not just Disney. The sources lump Star Trek and Doctor Who in their two legacy franchise, now deep in what they call the apathy phase after a constant conflicting timeline and alienating large parts.
Now, the interesting angle here is linking this destruction to the underlying business philosophy. It wasn't just bad creative decisions, the argument goes.
Right. The sources frame it as a symptom of this IP era's venture capitalist. It's Wall Street thinking infecting Hollywood.
What does that mean,
It means the old goal-making, tidy, consistent, sustainable profit wasn't enough. The Silicon Valley mindset over shared universe, infinite scalability, market dominance. Every single project needed the potential.
Which is almost impossible to replicate. Look at Universal's Dark Universe attempt.
Exactly. It crashed and burned with the mum. This relentless chase for the unicorn, this venture capital model, it had a huge casualty, the mid-budget movie.
The movies for grown-ups.
Pretty much. Smart dramas, comedy, thrillers that weren't based on a comic book or toy. The sources argue that space just evaporated. Why? Because studios, driven by this need for massive, universe-spawning hit, couldn't justify investing in smaller films with potentially smaller but reliable return. Creative risk was out, franchise familiarity was in.
And that obsession with IP, with the franchise itself, had another consequence: death of the movie star.
Yeah, this is a key point. If the IP is the real star, the economic end, then the actor playing the part become, well, less important, secondary.
How did that play out?
The sources put it blunt. Captain America is the star, right? Thor is the star. The actor, like Anthony Mackie playing Falcon Captain America, isn't necessarily a movie star in a sense. He can't automatically open a non-Marvel film based on his name alone. He's associated with the IP. This massively reduced the bargaining power and cultural cachet of individual actors.
And the sources also suggest the actors kind of helped this along themselves by being constantly on social media.
That's part of the argument. The mystique vanished. When the audience feels like they know the celebrity intimately through Instagram or Twitter, that godlike aura...
Plus the political stuff.
Right. Combine that overexposure with constant political lecturing actors, telling people how to vote, think, feel, the sources argue, it just completely alienated huge swaths of the potential audience. The connection broke. They weren't aspirational figures anymore.
Okay, so all this is happening. Audience alienation, IP destruction, the fading movie star, and then the entire industry decides to bet the farm on streaming, which turned out to be
a financial black hole, an absolute disaster, according to the numbers cited.
Let's get specific. Disney's loss.
Stagger. One source points to a single quarter where Disney lost $1.5 billion, billion with a B, on streaming. And it wasn't just startup costs. Disney Plus actually lost subscribers over 4 million in a few months at one point. Even with all that Marvel and Star Wars content, they couldn't sustain the growth.
And it wasn't just Disney, right? Others were bleeding cash too.
Oh, yeah. Peacock, Paramount Plus. The sources mention quarters where they each lost over half a billion per quarter. This model was hemorrhaging money across the board.
Which suggests a massive crisis in leadership.
You'd think so. And the sources point to the executive chaos as proof. The dramatic firing of Disney CEO Bob Chapek literally in the middle of the night on a Sunday, as one source put it.
And replacing him with Bob Iger, the previous CEO.
Who the sources ironically label the architect of all their failures. The fact that the board's only solution was to bring back the guy who built the system that was currently collapsed, well, that speaks volumes about the depth of the crisis. A real lack of fresh ideas or a viable alternative top.
So if it wasn't just bad leadership, the sources argue the model itself was flawed.
Deeply flawed. The whole streaming promise to Wall Street was built on this idea of predictable, subscription-based profit. Smooth, recurring revenue. but the sources call it basically an unsustainable scam. It required massive, ongoing content spending, fueled by debt, and it never generated the profits needed to justify the investment.
And it killed the old money making. Theatrical windows, home video.
Exactly. It destroyed the windowing model. That careful sequential release strategy theater, then rental purchase, then pay cable, then broadcast maximized revenue at each step. When Warner Bros. Did that simultaneous release of their entire 2021 slate in theaters and on apps.
Yeah, I remember the uproar.
They basically trained audiences not to go.
Yeah.
They cannibalized their own revenue streams for the sake of boosting subscriber numbers for Wall Street. Short-term thinking that, the sources argue, inflicted long-term, possibly fatal damage on the traditional profit model. It was vulture capitalism feasting on the industry.
Okay, so the financial model is broken, the audience is annoyed, the IP is weakening, and then we get the strike, the WGA and SAG strikes of 2023.
Right. And the crucial context the sources provide is that these weren't just typical Hollywood labor disputes. We've seen those before. These strikes hit at the precise moment the industry was already in what they're calling apocalypse.
They were symptoms, not the primary cause of the illness.
That's the argument. They landed right when the audience was already checked out, suffering from woke Hollywood fatigue, as the sources term it. This convergence just poured gasoline on the fire.
And the economic impact was huge, wasn't it?
The estimates cited were around $200 to $250 million per day lost economy because everything just ground to a halt and the industry was already so fragile. The strikes really exposed the underlying.
Let's look at the writer's side first, the WGA. What were their core demands?
Pretty standard labor stuff on the surface. Fair pay, obviously. A big one was residuals from streaming getting paid fairly when shows are successful on Netflix or Disney+. And crucially, transparency. They wanted to see the viewership numbers, which the streamers guard, like states.
Because that's how residuals used to work, based on measurable success.
Exact. Plus, job security, trying to regulate those exploitive mini rooms, and of course, protections against AI taking their jobs. These were legitimate concerns arising from how the business had changed.
But the sources add a wrinkle here, don't they? The bad writing critique.
Yeah, this is where it gets messy. Anonymous sources, industry observers, quoted in the material, they argue that while the WGA had valid points about pay, their case was weakened by the fact that, well, a lot of the writing coming out of Hollywood recently has been perceived as objectively bad.
To name names. Or shows.
Oh, yeah. Shows like Marvel's She-Hulk, Amazon's Rings of Power, enormous budgets, years of development time, all the money in the world as one source. And yet the end products were divisive, heavily criticized, or just didn't connect.
So the argument is, how can you demand significantly more pay and guaranteed jobs when the quality control seems to have collapsed?
That's the tension. Is the problem just corporate greed squeezing writers, or is there also a problem with the talent pool, the creative process, the quality of the work being produced, maybe exacerbated by some of those DEI mentioned earlier?
Let's talk about the mini room problem specifically. You mentioned it. Can you break that down? It sounds like a key grievance.
It really is. See, traditionally, getting staffed on a TV show meant joining a writer's room for the whole season. Good pay, stable work, often for multiple seasons if the show is a hit. You learn the craft, built relationships.
The old system.
Right. The mini room, as described by the sources, is completely different. It's basically a short-term gig, maybe just a small group of writers are hired at lower rates to just break the story or map out the season before the show is even greenlit for full production.
So it's like a long, underpaid audition.
Essentially, yes. And then often those writers are let go. The showrunner takes their ideas, hires maybe one or two writers for the actual production, and avoids paying full WGA scale or residuals to that initial group for the life of the show. It compresses wages, creates instability, and burns through writers.
Definitely sounds exploitative. But again, the counter critique from the sources is that the WGA's proposed solutions like mandating minimum room sizes or guaranteed weeks of work, regardless of need, could backfire.
Yeah, the concern raised is that it might force studios to hire writers they don't need or keep rooms open longer than necessary, potentially rewarding mediocrity and further straining already tight budgets, especially if the quality isn't there to begin with. It's fighting corporate tactics with union mandates that might not foster the best creative outcome.
Now, while the writers and actors were on the picket line, how did the studios react? The sources paint a pretty brutal picture of the corporate strike.
Brutal is the word. They describe it as a corporate purge. There was that chilling quote attributed to an anonymous anonymous studio executive. Their game plan was supposedly to let strikes drag on until union members were losing their housing.
Wow. Using financial ruin as leverage. Did that actually happen?
According to accounts from actors and writers cited in the sources, yes. Many non-celebrity union members faced severe financial hardship, losing home, apartments. The studios knew the rank and file couldn't hold out forever.
So the strikes became an opportunity.
A grim opportunity, yes, to accelerate contraction. They used force majeure clauses, blaming the strike as an unforeseen event, preventing them from fulfilling contracts to get out of expensive deals.
Like those big producer deals.
Exactly. Warner Brothers suspending deals with J.J. Abrams, Mindy Kaling, Amazon canceling shows like The Peripheral post-renewal, citing the strike as a convenient excuse. It allowed them to slash costs, shelf projects that maybe weren't home runs anyway, and basically clean house under the cover of the labor dispute. The Purge was underway.
So, in the middle of all this industry chaos and financial pain, how did the general public react? Did they rally behind the writers and actors?
Not really, according to the sources. They highlight this massive disconnect between the high-profile celebrity activism, you saw lots of big stars on the picket lines, and actual public.
Why the disconnect?
The argument is that years of celebrity preaching, those videos telling people how to vote, lecturing on social issues, it had already worn thin. That Avengers video urging people to vote a certain way is often cited as a turning point where audiences just tuned out celebrities.
So when the strike happened, people just didn't care.
Apathy seems to be the key finding. Polling data cited showed most Americans ranked the strikes very low on their list of economic concerns. It just wasn't registering compared to inflation or gas prices.
And some people were actually happy.
That's the really stark part. Some quotes suggest people were enjoying the hell out of it. They saw it as Hollywood getting its comeuppance after years of perceived arrogance and disregard for the audience. The celebrity activism completely backfired, turning potential public support into indifference or even hostility. Hashtag AV, introspection, contraction, and the unwokening.
Okay, so we've got ideological backlash, financial collapse, IP fatigue, disastrous streaming pivots, and brutal strike. This cumulative pressure, the sources argue, is finally forcing some kind of reckoning inside Hollywood. Introspection, maybe.
Or maybe just panic. The language coming from inside the industry, cited in these reports, is pretty showrunners using terms like death spiral, cinema apocalypse. There's a sense that the model is fundamentally broken and the money is drying up.
And when the money dries up,
ideological purity tends to become a luxury you can't afford. This is where the sources start talking about a potential great unwokening, a retreat forced by financial reality from some of the more aggressive ideas.
Is there actual evidence of this, or is it just speculation?
There are some concrete examples cited. Take Disney. It's been central to this whole. They reportedly pulled a transgender storyline from an upcoming Pixar's called Win or Lose.
Why? What was the reasoning given?
Significantly, the reason cited was direct feedback about parental, something along the lines of, many parents would prefer to discuss certain subjects with their children on their own terms and timeline.
That sounds like a definite shift from, say, a few years ago, when some creators were openly talking about pushing specific agendas. It sounds like listening to the customer.
It suggests a move away from prioritizing the message over the audience's comfort level, especially the family audience that Disney relies on. We're also seeing figures like former Bond girl Gemma Arterton publicly pushing back against certain trends.
What did she say?
She argued that making James Bond a woman would be too outrageous, stressing the need to respect the character's tradition and legacy. These might seem like small things, but the sources interpret them as signs that the constant push for modern subversion is being recognized as financially toxic.
Let's go back inside the writers, because the sources really detail the internal conflict around DEI, painting it as almost weaponized.
Yeah, based on anonymous testimony from WGA members themselves, people who often identify as liberal, there's a picture of a pretty hostile environment for writers who don't fit certain profiles.
Hostile in what way? What are they actually reporting?
Things like being told that not knowing the source material for a franchise is actually a good thing.
Seriously, why?
Because apparently executives want a modern new take unburdened by respect for the original IP. So experience, knowledge, fandom things you'd think would be assets are sometimes seen as negatives if they get in the way of a mandated ideological revision.
And the hiring practices themselves. You mentioned the DEI scorecard.
Right. Writers describe this system of 2 furs or 3 furs, meaning a candidate who checks multiple diversity boxes, say gay, black, and female, is inherently more valuable for meeting the quotas than someone who only checks 1 box or none.
Regardless of talent or experience.
That's the critique. It becomes a numbers game, actively discriminating against writers, even progressive ones, if they happen to be, say, a straight white male or even just a white female, because they don't score high enough on the DEI metrics needed for the project to get approved or funded.
That must create an incredible amount of fear and resentment.
Absolutely. The quotes are stark. Writers saying they're terrified to publicly say anything critical of the DEI mandate, feeling excluded from job opportunities solely because of my age, gender, and skin color. The argument is that this attempt to correct past discrimination has ended up creating new forms of it, stifling open discussion and potentially contributing to the decline in writing quality.
It's a complex internal dynamic, and it seems even mainstream outlets are starting to notice the artistic consequences.
They are. The sources point to a New York Times piece, of all places, that called out the showy, self-satisfied gender swapping in recent movies. It argued that films trying desperately hard to be modern, like No Time to Die, which the piece suggests made Bond seem incompetent in his own film, actually end up feeling dated
because they're reacting to a specific political moment, not aiming for something timely.
Exactly. The pressure to be relevant, to tick the boxes, resulted in art that wasn't built to last. And Hollywood seems to be slowly, painfully realizing that this approach might be creatively and financially bankrupt.
Meanwhile, the physical purge, the contraction, just keeps going.
Relentlessly. We're seeing massive layoffs across the board. Pixar, NBC Universal, Amazon Studios, Paramount. These aren't minor trims. These are significant reductions, signaling a fundamental shrinking of the traditional.
And the pipeline of new movies.
Dramatic. The projections cited for wide releases in 2024 show a steep drop compared to 20. One example given was July 2024 having only 4 new wide releases planned compared to 8.
Fewer movies, likely safer bet.
Probably. More sequels, more reboots of proven property, less risk. The overall picture painted by the sources is bleak. Hollywood experiencing a death by 1,000 cuts, talent and executives fleeing woke Hollywood, and the industry essentially committing financial suicide by breaking its business model while simultaneously pushing away its core customers. #outro. So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway from this deep dive for you, the listener?
Well, the sources paint a picture of a perfect storm, really. You had a fundamentally broken streaming model driven by corporate greed, meeting head-on with IP exhaustion.
Right. The franchises just ran out of steam.
And layered on top of that was this sharp ideological shift, a focus on progressive activism, on enforcing DEI mandates that ended up prioritizing messaging over simply entertaining the broad audience that pays the bills. And that convergence led to this existential crisis.
And the sources really stress that huge, maybe unintended consequence. The audience they pushed away didn't just disappear. Exactly. People aren't just sitting at home staring at a blank screen. They're on YouTube, they're on TikTok, they're listening to podcasts. Some are even making their own content. Or maybe the most damning indictment, they're just rewatching the great movies and TV shows Hollywood used to make, which are often available right there on the same streaming service next to the disappointing news.
Hollywood used to be the gatekeeper, the center of passive entertainment, but the culture's changed.
It really has. Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with, something sparked by a Douglas Adams observation. He noted that the 20th century was pretty much the only time we even needed the word interact. Think about it. Before radio, film, TV, most entertainment was interactive plays, music halls, games.
That's interesting. We think of passive media as the norm, but maybe it was the exception.
And now, technology, the internet, social media, streaming choice has put agency back in your hand. We're returning to a culture that expects interaction, expects choice, and frankly doesn't have much patience for being lectured or told what to like.
So the final question the sources leave us with is this. Can Hollywood survive by just shrinking, retreating back to that old passive model for a smaller audience? Or does it need a fundamental reset? Does it have to change its entire approach to actually engage with and respect this interactive, choice-driven, and increasingly critical culture?
And ultimately, the sources suggest the answer to that question won't come from executives or critics. It'll come from you, the audience, decided with your time and your money.